The unbelievable story of the women who saved a city with love. The sky over Weinsberg was a blanket of gray, thick with the smoke of burning fields. From the walls of the fortress, the defenders watched with dread as the army of King Conrad III encircled them like a steel serpent. His banners, black eagles on golden fields, fluttered in the wind, a symbol of inevitable conquest. For weeks the siege had ground on. Arrows rained against the walls, siege engines hurled stones that shattered against the ancient towers, and the sound of war drums thundered across the valley. Inside the fortress, fear grew like a plague. Food was running low, and hope was a fragile thread. Men spoke in whispers, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. Women huddled together, shielding their children's eyes from the horror beyond the walls. But no one spoke of surrender. Not yet. In the great hall, the Duke of Wealth paced like a caged wolf. His knights, bloodied and weary, stood silent around him, their armor dented, their faces shadowed. "We cannot hold them," one whispered, his voice heavy with despair. "If we do not surrender, they will slaughter us all." The Duke's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. He knew the truth. He had seen the king's army, a sea of iron that stretched to the horizon. The king wanted vengeance. The Duke had defied him, stood against his rule, and now the price of that defiance would be death. But even as the Duke wrestled with despair, another voice rose above the whispers. A woman's voice, strong and clear. "If we cannot fight them, we must outsmart them," she declared. Heads turned, and there stood Matilda, a woman of fierce eyes and unyielding will. She was no queen, no noblewoman, but she was a leader in her own right, a voice of courage among the fearful. Matilda's words spread like wildfire. The men spoke of last stands and glorious deaths, but the women whispered of survival. "They will spare us," Matilda insisted, "because they see us as weak. But that will be their mistake." Her plan took shape in the shadows of the fortress. The women would not beg for mercy. They would seize it. And as the fires burned beyond the walls, as the enemy drums pounded a relentless rhythm, Matilda rallied the women, giving them courage when all seemed lost. "We are not just survivors," she told them. "We are their strength. We are their hope." But even as she spoke, the sound of a great horn echoed across the valley. A rider, bearing the king's standard, approached the gates. His voice rang out like a thunderclap. "Hear this, defenders of Weinsberg! Your resistance is at an end. Surrender, and the women and children may leave unharmed. The men will face the king's judgment." The great hall erupted in fury. The men shouted in anger, their pride stung by the king's cruel terms. But Matilda stood firm, her gaze unflinching. "They would spare us because they think we are nothing, but we will show them our strength." A silence fell over the hall, and the Duke, his voice heavy with grief, nodded. "We will surrender," he whispered. The gates creaked open, and the terms were accepted. The men would remain to face whatever fate the king decided. But the women, they were free to leave, carrying whatever they could upon their backs, a cruel mercy meant to humiliate, to break the spirit of the defeated. But Matilda's eyes shone with fierce determination. As dawn broke, the gates swung wide, and the women of Weinsberg stepped forward. But they did not carry gold or jewels, nor fine silks or silver. Instead, each woman carried a man upon her back. Husbands, fathers, brothers, warriors who had defended the walls now clung to their wives, their pride wounded but their spirits unbroken. Matilda led them, her husband draped over her shoulders, his arms wrapped around her neck. The women walked with slow, steady steps, their faces grim, their eyes unyielding. They walked past the king's soldiers, who stared in shock, their laughter dying on their lips. In the midst of the king's army, King Conrad himself rode forward, his expression a mask of iron. For a long moment he said nothing, watching this procession of courage and defiance. His captains whispered to him, urging him to stop the women, to strike them down, to punish them for their audacity. But the king raised his hand. "Let them pass," he declared. His voice was cold, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of respect, a hint of shame. The women of Weinsberg walked past the sea of soldiers unchallenged, their burden heavy but their spirits unbroken. They had turned the king's mercy into a weapon, his humiliation into a triumph. And in the shadow of the smoking fortress, they became legends. But the story was not over. In the hills beyond the king's camp, the women and their husbands paused, their hearts still racing. They were free, but they were also homeless, cast adrift in a land still torn by war. Matilda stood among them, her eyes fixed on the distant fortress. "We are not beaten," she whispered, and the others listened. "We are not helpless. We are not defeated. We are alive, and that means we can fight." Around her, faces that had been shadowed with despair began to light with hope. Matilda's defiance had saved them, but now she would need to lead them. The forest beyond the fortress of Weinsberg was a sanctuary, but also a prison. Trees loomed overhead, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. The cold wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it the distant echoes of the king's army. The women of Weinsberg gathered in a clearing, their husbands and sons slumped at their feet, weary and ashamed. Some men hid their faces, unable to look at their wives who had carried them to safety. Others clutched swords they could barely lift, their pride shattered. But Matilda stood tall among them, her fierce eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Listen to me," she cried, her voice a sharp crack that cut through the silence. "You are not cowards. You are survivors. And now we must become something more. We must become fighters." But not all agreed. A burly, scarred man named Berthold stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "Fighters?" he spat. "Against the king's army? We are lucky we are alive. We should scatter, hide in the villages, and pray we are forgotten." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, fear taking root once again. Matilda did not flinch. "Hide!" she demanded, her voice a blade. "And when the king's soldiers come to hunt us, when our homes are burned, our children dragged away, will you hide then too?" Berthold sneered. "And what would you have us do, Matilda? March back and die like heroes?" "No," she answered, her voice steel. "We will not die. We will fight smart. We will fight like shadows." Her gaze swept over the weary faces, her voice rising with a fierce energy. "We are not just women who carried our husbands to safety. We are the women who shamed a king. We are the ones who survived. And that makes us dangerous." A spark of hope flickered in the eyes of those who listened. Even Berthold, who had mocked her, felt a shiver of something he had not felt in days. Courage. The forest became their refuge. Under Matilda's command, the women and men set to work. They built shelters from fallen branches, crafted weapons from whatever they could scavenge. The men, who had once been defenders of the fortress, now became hunters and scouts, but it was the women who led. Matilda taught them to move silently, to hide in the shadows, to use the forest as a weapon. They struck at the king's supply lines, not in open battle, but in the dead of night. A wagon of food vanished here, a guard post burned there. The king's men whispered of ghosts, of vengeful spirits that stalked the woods. But they were not ghosts. They were the women of Weinsberg, and their fury was a fire that would not be quenched. Matilda became a legend in her own right. Scouts spoke of a woman who moved like a shadow, who could vanish into the trees like mist. Her voice, once a whisper of defiance in a fortress of despair, became a rallying cry. "For Weinsberg!" they would shout, and the enemy would shudder. But Matilda knew that survival in the forest was not enough. The king's army still occupied Weinsberg. The men who had surrendered remained prisoners, used as labor to rebuild the shattered fortress. And the king, though humiliated, was not a man to forget an insult. He had allowed the women to leave, but now they had become a thorn in his side. In his war tent, King Conrad III brooded over reports of his raided supply lines. His captains spoke of demons, of rebel warriors. But the king knew the truth. "It is the women," he muttered, his voice thick with contempt and a flicker of fear. "The ones I showed mercy." His captains laughed nervously, but the king's gaze was cold. "Mercy is a mistake I will not repeat." Orders were given, and a column of soldiers was sent to sweep the forest. "Burn it," the king commanded. "Smoke them out like rats." But the forest was not an enemy that could be crushed so easily. Matilda's scouts saw the column coming, and she prepared her people. "We cannot fight them head-on," she told them, "but we can make them bleed." As the king's men marched beneath the dark trees, arrows whispered from the shadows. Fallen logs crashed down upon their ranks, figures darted between the trees, and men screamed as hidden pits swallowed them. Panic spread like wildfire. "Hold your lines!" the captain shouted, but his words were drowned by the roar of a burning canopy as the forest itself seemed to rise against them. Matilda's people struck and vanished, their laughter haunting the survivors. And when the fires finally died, the king's column lay in ruins, scattered bodies, charred trees, and a silence that spoke of defeat. But Matilda did not allow herself to celebrate. As the survivors of the king's column staggered back to Weinsberg, spreading tales of ghosts and witchcraft, she knew the king would not rest. He would send more men, and each time his rage would grow. The forest had become a battlefield, but it could also become a grave. Matilda stood among her people, her voice calm but sharp. "We are winning shadows, but shadows cannot rule. If we want to save our home, we must become more. We must be a storm." Faces turned to her. Men who had once doubted her now stood with eyes fierce and determined. Women who had once wept now sharpened blades with steady hands. But even as they whispered of victory, Matilda's gaze turned to the distant towers of Weinsberg. They had saved their loved ones. They had humiliated a king, but they were still exiles. And Matilda, beneath her fierce pride, knew the truth. They were not free until Weinsberg was theirs again. Matilda leaned against a thick oak, her eyes scanning the misty forest as the camp stirred awake behind her. Morning dew sparkled on the leaves, but beneath the beauty lay tension. Fires were reduced to embers, and smoke curled lazily toward the sky. Footsteps crunched on the damp earth, and a voice broke the quiet. "Matilda, another cart," whispered Berthold, crouching beside her, his scarred face shadowed by the trees. "2 guards, same route. Could be an ambush." Matilda's lips curved into a fierce smile. "Or it could be another gift from the king. He keeps sending his silver and we keep taking it. Let's not disappoint him." She turned, her voice rising just enough to carry. "Hilda, Greta, you know what to do." The 2 women, bows slung across their backs, exchanged a grin. Hilda winked. "Arrows or smiles?" she teased. "I can kill with either." "Arrows first, smiles later," Matilda shot back. "Unless you want to invite the king's men for a dance." Greta knocked an arrow, her grin fading to a fierce determination. "Let's see if they can dance around this." The forest seemed to hold its breath as the women melted into the shadows. Matilda watched them go, a mix of pride and anxiety tightening her chest. They were becoming warriors, but they were still risking everything. Minutes passed, each heartbeat a drumbeat in her ears. Then the faintest shout, a cry cut short, silence. Moments later, the rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs announced their return. Hilda's bow was slung across her back, but she wore a grin. 2 guards, both asleep, permanently, she reported. And the cart, full of grain, salted pork, and wine. Wine? Berthold's eyes lit up. Maybe the king wants to apologize for the siege. Generous of him. Or it's poison, Greta warned, raising an eyebrow. Matilda shook her head. The king is cruel, but he's not clever enough for that. Distribute the food, but save the wine. We'll use it for a celebration if we live long enough. Around them, the camp came alive, men and women moving with newfound confidence. They were no longer just refugees. They were a force. As they feasted on their spoils, laughter echoed through the trees. Even Berthold, who had once scoffed at Matilda, raised a cup in her direction. To the ghosts of Weinsberg, he toasted, who never go hungry. Matilda smiled, but her gaze drifted toward the distant fortress, its towers barely visible beyond the mist. Ghosts can only haunt, she murmured. We must do more. But her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden crash of branches and the ragged, desperate gasps of a young boy stumbling into the clearing. His face was streaked with mud and tears, his clothes torn. "They're coming!" he cried, his voice a high, trembling wail. "The king's men! They're burning the forest!" A hush fell over the camp, and Matilda's eyes hardened. "Where? How many?" she demanded, kneeling before the boy. "Everywhere," he sobbed. "Hundreds. They said they would burn us out like wolves." Berthold spat into the dirt. "We knew this would happen. Sooner or later, he would come for us." Matilda stood, her voice sharp and clear. "Then we make him regret it. Greta, Hilda, you know the trails. Lead the families to the eastern caves. They're safe there." Her gaze swept over the men. "The rest of you, with me. We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on, but we can make them bleed." Berthold's hand clenched around his sword. "Ambushes, hit and run. The shadows are our strength." "And the fire is theirs," Matilda snapped. "So we use it against them." Smoke began to curl between the trees, a thick, acrid scent that clawed at the throat. The shouts of the king's soldiers grew louder, axes hacking at the underbrush, torches blazing. But Matilda's people were ready. From the trees, arrows rained down on the advancing soldiers. Logs, rigged with ropes, crashed down upon the enemy. The king's men, expecting a hunt, found themselves hunted. "Matilda!" Greta's voice rang out. "The western flank! They're pushing through!" Matilda's head snapped around. "Hilda, take the left. Berthold, with me. We cut them off." She sprinted through the trees, her heart pounding, the heat of the spreading fire warming her cheeks. But this was her forest. These were her people, and she would not let them be slaughtered. Bursting through the smoke, she saw them. A column of the king's men, shields raised, their faces shadowed by helms. But they were trapped, pressed against a ridge with the fire at their backs. And Matilda's people were ready. With a cry, they surged forward, a fierce rush of blades and fury. One soldier lunged at Matilda, his sword a blur, but she sidestepped, her dagger flashing, his throat opened in a spray of crimson. Berthold crashed into another, his axe cleaving through a shield. Around them the forest roared with chaos, fire, screams, the clash of steel. But the king's men were disciplined, their captain's voice rising above the din. "Hold the line! Cut them down!" Matilda's heart raced, but she saw the panic in their eyes. "The fire is your enemy, not us!" she shouted, and in that moment one of the king's men faltered, then another. The line broke, and the soldiers scattered, running headlong into the smoke. Panting, Matilda lowered her bloodied dagger. Around her, her people stood triumphant but weary. Greta limped from the trees, a cut on her arm. "They'll be back," she warned, her voice grim. "They will," Matilda agreed, her voice calm. "But we will be waiting." Berthold approached, his armor smeared with ash, his face streaked with sweat. "You keep surprising me, Matilda. A woman leads a rebellion. Never thought I'd see it." "Neither did I," she replied, her eyes hard but warm. "But then again, I never thought I'd be saving fools like you." Laughter rippled through the weary survivors. Even as the forest smoldered around them, they stood tall. Matilda's defiance was a flame that would not be snuffed out, but the laughter of Matilda's people pierced the haze like sunlight. Even as the fires smoldered and the king's men retreated, they stood together, weary but unbroken. Matilda leaned against a charred tree, catching her breath, but her sharp eyes swept over her people, wounded, bruised, but alive. Berthold staggered over, wiping ash from his face. "You did it again, Matilda," he panted. "You made them run. You made soldiers of the Empire run." "I didn't make them run, Berthold," Matilda corrected, a fierce smile on her lips. "We did. All of us. We made them fear the shadows." Greta limped closer, a bandage wrapped around her arm. "Fear the shadows?" she laughed. "They fear the women. Never thought I'd see the day." "Nor did I," came a voice. Hilda, her bow still in hand, a tired grin on her face. "When I married a baker, I thought I'd be baking bread, not fighting armies." Matilda's gaze swept over them, her voice rising. "We were bakers, and seamstresses, and mothers, but today, we are warriors. Not because we chose this, but because we refuse to be victims." She paused, her eyes burning with a fierce light. "The king calls us rebels, but we are something far more powerful. We are free." A murmur of agreement swept through the group. Even the men who had once hidden their shame stood straighter now, their hands tightening around swords and spears. Berthold clapped Greta on the shoulder. "Not bad for a seamstress," he grinned. "Think you could stitch me up if I take another arrow?" Greta snorted. "Keep talking and I'll stitch your mouth shut." Matilda laughed, but the humor was brief. Her gaze turned serious. "We've won a fight, but the war is far from over. The king will return, and next time he won't just send his men, he will bring his wrath." "Let him," Hilda spat, her voice sharp. "He thinks we are just peasants with sticks. He doesn't understand. We have something he never will." "What's that?" Berthold asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Each other," Matilda said simply, "and a cause worth fighting for." Her words washed over them, a warmth against the cold fear that had once gripped their hearts. Men who had once doubted her now looked at her with something close to awe. Greta raised her bow, her voice ringing clear. "For Weinsberg!" she shouted. "For Weinsberg!" The crowd roared back, their voices a thunderclap that shook the trees, but Matilda knew words alone would not keep them safe. As the day wore on, she called them together, a circle of weary but determined faces. "We cannot just hide in the forest forever," she told them. "If we remain as ghosts, we will be hunted as ghosts. We must become a force, a voice that cannot be silenced." Berthold frowned. "You mean, you want us to fight in the open? Attack the king's camps?" "No," Matilda replied, her gaze fierce. "We fight with our strength. We fight with courage, but also with cunning. We strike when they do not expect, we retreat when they advance, and we protect our own." She stepped forward, her voice rising. "But we do not fight for vengeance. We fight for freedom, for a life where our children are not born slaves, where our homes are not burned because we defied a king." Her words struck like arrows, piercing the fear in their hearts. Even the youngest boys, who had once wept with terror, now listened with wide, eager eyes. "But what if they crush us?" one of them whispered. "Then we stand together," Matilda answered, "and we become legends." A murmur swept through the crowd, a wave of resolve. Greta raised her bow again. "We fight for our homes, our families, and for those who cannot fight." Berthold grinned, his heavy axe resting on his shoulder. "And if the king wants a fight, we'll give him a nightmare." But it was Matilda's voice that rose above the rest, a voice that seemed to swell with the strength of the forest itself. "We are not just survivors. We are not just ghosts. We are the women who carried our husbands from the jaws of death. We are the men who learned to stand again. We are the ones who turned shame into strength, who made the mighty king tremble in his tent. And if he comes again, we will remind him why." A roar of approval surged through the group. They were not just a band of refugees anymore. They were an army, small, ragged, but unbreakable. As the sun set, Matilda stood by the edge of the camp, watching the sky bleed red and gold. Greta approached, her voice soft. "Do you think we can really win, Matilda? Against a king? Against an empire?" Matilda's gaze never wavered. "I don't know if we can win, but I know we will not be slaves. Not ever again." Greta smiled, a tear tracing her cheek. "Then that is enough." The wind stirred the trees, carrying the distant call of a horn, a reminder that the king's army still loomed beyond the forest. But now the horn was not a sound of terror. It was a challenge. Matilda's people scattered, taking their positions, their eyes sharp, their hands steady. They were ready. The sun was a pale, cold disk overhead, barely piercing the mist that clung to the forest. But beneath that gray sky, Matilda's camp was alive. The people moved with a sense of purpose, sharpening weapons, weaving new traps, whispering strategies around the crackling fires. But it was the laughter that echoed most. Laughter, sharp and fierce, a sound that seemed to taunt the king's soldiers patrolling beyond the tree line. "Matilda!" Hilda's voice rang out, and Matilda turned to see her friend striding toward her, a grin on her face. "We caught one of the king's scouts. Poor fool thought we were just ghosts." Matilda's smile was thin. "And is he talking?" "Talking?" Hilda chuckled. "He's singing. Berthold's got him tied to a tree, and I think our dear Greta is terrifying him just by staring." Matilda followed Hilda through the forest, her boots crunching on frost-tipped leaves. The scout was a young man, barely older than a boy, his hands bound, his face pale. His wide, frightened eyes darted from Berthold's scowling face to Greta's silent, icy glare. "Please," the scout stammered. "I'm just a messenger. I don't even carry a sword." Berthold leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "And what message were you carrying? Orders to burn the forest? Orders to drag us out in chains?" The boy shook his head, tears pooling in his eyes. No, I swear, I was told to scout the forest, to find the rebels who have been attacking the king's supply lines." "Rebels?" Greta's voice was a whisper, sharp as a blade. "Is that what they call us? We who carry our families on our backs, who save our children from fire? Rebels?" Matilda stepped forward, her gaze piercing. "Listen to me, boy. What is the king planning? More soldiers? Another burning? Does he think we will just vanish into smoke?" The boy swallowed, his voice trembling. He's gathering his knights. They're preparing to march. They say the forest will be cleared, burned until nothing is left." Berthold spat. "Typical. If they can't catch a fox, they'll burn the whole den." "Which means we must be more than foxes," Matilda murmured, her mind racing. "We must be fire ourselves." Greta's hand tightened around her bow. "What do you mean?" Matilda's voice rose, sharp and clear. "We won't wait for him to come to us. We will strike first. The king thinks we are shadows, so we will become a storm." Berthold grinned, his eyes gleaming. "Ambush? Hit them where they least expect?" "More than that," Matilda declared. "We will take the fight to his camp. We will make him see that we are not just survivors, but warriors." Her gaze turned to the trembling scout. "You will carry a message for me." The boy's face paled. A message?" Matilda's smile was fierce. "You will tell the king that the women of Weinsberg are coming for him, that he will have no sleep, no safety, no victory as long as we live. Tell him that the forest will swallow him whole, The boy stared, then nodded desperately. I will tell him. Please, just don't kill me. Matilda's voice softened, just a little. You are not our enemy. But remember this. Those who obey tyrants become part of their chains. The ropes were cut, and the boy stumbled to his feet. Greta stepped aside, her icy glare never leaving him. Run, she whispered, and the boy did, a streak of fear vanishing into the trees. Berthold watched him go, then turned to Matilda. You think he'll deliver your message? Oh, he will, Matilda replied, her voice cold. Fear is a faster messenger than courage. The camp buzzed with energy. Matilda's people gathered, listening as she laid out her plan. The king expects us to hide, to defend, but we will strike. We will be everywhere, the river crossing, the forest paths, his very doorstep. We will be the storm he cannot escape. Greta nodded, her eyes sharp. Small groups, fast, silent. We hit them before they know we're there. Hilda grinned, her bow already strung. I'll take the eastern route. Those supply wagons are always slow and heavy. I'll take the southern pass, Berthold declared, his axe resting on his shoulder. Show them that a ghost can carry a heavy swing. Matilda's gaze swept over them, pride swelling in her chest. And remember, we fight for our homes, our families, for each other. We are not just survivors. We are a promise. We are a warning. The night fell, cold and silent, but the forest was alive with shadows, shadows that moved like whispers, striking in the darkness. A sentry's torch was snuffed out, a wagon's wheel shattered, a tent collapsed in a flurry of screams. The king's camp, once a place of strength, became a hive of fear. In his grand tent, King Conrad paced, his armored boots grinding against the rug. What is this madness? He snarled. They are peasants, beggars. How do they strike at will? They move like ghosts, sire, one of his captains stammered, his helmet clutched in his shaking hands. They come and go without warning. We see nothing but shadows. Then burn the shadows, the king roared. Scour the forest, raze it to the ground. But even as his orders thundered, a faint, flickering light danced across the walls of his tent, the shadow of a woman, her face fierce, her eyes blazing. And the king, for just a moment, felt a chill that no fire could banish. Miles away, Matilda watched the glow of the burning camp from the hillside. Greta stood beside her, her expression fierce. Do you think he will come for us now? Oh, he will, Matilda whispered, her voice a blade. But he will not find frightened women in a fortress. He will find warriors, and he will learn that some flames cannot be smothered. The forest was alive with whispers. Shadows flitted between the trees, but these were not the ghosts the king's men feared. They were Matilda's people. Women with bows and daggers, men with axes and spears, their eyes sharp, their steps silent. Smoke curled against the gray sky, a reminder of the king's fury. He had sent his soldiers to burn the forest, to root out the rebels, but the forest had become a battlefield, and Matilda's people knew every path, every shadow. Near a rocky ridge, Berthold crouched, his axe resting on his shoulder, his scarred face twisted with a fierce grin. They march like blind cattle, he whispered, watching the column of the king's soldiers below. Do they think we will stand still and let them crush us? Let them march, Greta murmured beside him, her bow drawn, an arrow ready. They think they are hunters. We will show them what it means to be hunted. Matilda's voice was a quiet command. Wait for my signal. She stood just behind them, her gaze sharp, her hand raised. Her people had become an army of whispers, an army of shadows. The king thought he could drown them in fire, but fire only made them stronger. The column marched below, swords clinking, shields glinting. The captain, a burly knight with a crimson plume, barked orders. Search every thicket, every cave, no mercy for traitors. Matilda's fingers tightened, but she did not move. Not yet. Her eyes scanned the forest, watching as the column stretched thin. The captain rode at the front, his knights close behind. But the foot soldiers lagged, their faces weary, their armor stained with mud. Perfect. Now, Matilda whispered, and her people moved as one. Arrows rained from the trees, whispering like death. The soldiers cried out, shields clattering, their formation crumbling. Greta's shot struck the captain's squire, and the boy toppled from his horse with a scream. Berthold let out a roar, charging down the ridge, his axe flashing. Matilda's people followed, bursting from the trees with a fierce cry. The king's soldiers fought back, but their fear was palpable. They swung wildly at shadows, their shouts lost in the chaos. Matilda darted between them, her dagger slashing, her voice a sharp command. "Scatter them! Drive them into the trees!" A knight charged her, his sword raised, but Matilda was faster. She sidestepped, her blade catching his thigh. He stumbled, and she struck again, a fierce determination in her eyes. Around her, her people struck with precision. Vanish, strike, vanish again. The captain shouted, his voice desperate. Form up, you cowards!" But his men were panicking. One broke and ran, then another. Arrows found their backs, and the forest seemed to swallow them whole. Berthold laughed, his axe cleaving a shield in two. "Is this the king's might? A pack of frightened mice?" The captain's gaze locked on Matilda, and rage twisted his face. "Witch!" he roared, spurring his horse toward her. "I'll have your head!" But before he could reach her, Greta's arrow struck his chest. He lurched, his sword falling from his grip. His horse reared, and he crashed to the ground, his armor clattering. Matilda stepped forward, her dagger gleaming. The captain struggled, his breath ragged. You are nothing. Peasants playing at war." "Perhaps," Matilda whispered, kneeling beside him. "But it is our forest, our homes you burn, and even peasants can become storms." His eyes widened, and then the light in them faded. Matilda rose, wiping her dagger on her cloak. Around her, the shouts of battle faded, replaced by the quiet murmur of victory. Her people gathered, some bloodied, some bruised, but all alive. Greta lowered her bow, a fierce smile on her lips. "They came to burn us out. We burned their courage instead." "But they will send more," Hilda warned, stepping from the trees. "The king will not stop." "I hope he doesn't," Berthold laughed, leaning on his axe. "I'm starting to enjoy this." But Matilda's gaze was sharp, her voice calm. "Enjoy it too much, and you will become just like them." Her words struck like a splash of cold water, and the laughter faded. "We fight because we must, not because we love it. We fight for our homes, for our families, and we will keep fighting until the king learns that his cruelty has made him weaker, not stronger." Hilda frowned. "But what if he never learns? What if he brings his whole army?" Matilda's jaw tightened. "Then we will be ready, and we will not face him as shadows. We will face him as a force he cannot ignore." Berthold's grin returned. "We'll make him regret ever stepping into this forest." The survivors began to gather their wounded, to tend to the fallen. Matilda stood apart, her gaze fixed on the distant smoke curling above the treetops. Greta approached, her voice soft. "You're thinking again. That means trouble." "I'm always thinking, Greta. That's how we've lived this long," Matilda replied, but her voice was heavy. "But I keep thinking, this forest can only protect us for so long. The king has the numbers. He has the power." "Then what do we have?" Greta asked, her voice a whisper. Matilda turned, her gaze fierce. "We have each other. We have courage. And we have the truth, that this is our home, not his playground." Her voice rose, and those nearby turned to listen. "We are not just shadows in the trees. We are a flame that cannot be snuffed out. We are the storm that grows fiercer with every wind. If the king comes again, he will not find rebels. He will find a people who refuse to kneel." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Even the wounded raised their heads, their eyes shining. Matilda's voice was fire. "Let him come. Let him bring his knights, his armies. He will learn that we are not the ones who should fear the dark." Greta's smile returned. Her bow gripped tightly. "Lead us, Matilda. Show us how to turn shadows into storms." "I will," Matilda promised, her gaze fierce and unyielding. "And we will make history." And sunlight filtered through the branches like strands of gold. But beneath that beauty, Matilda's people prepared for war. Weapons were sharpened, bows were strung, and the air buzzed with whispered plans. Fires crackled, not with warmth, but with the fierce energy of those who had transformed fear into fury. Matilda stood before them, her eyes sweeping over the gathered faces. Men and women who had become warriors, children who watched with wide, fierce eyes, their innocence hardened by struggle. "Listen to me," Matilda called, her voice strong, cutting through the rustle of the forest. "We have fought them in shadows. We have struck and vanished. We have shown them that we are not helpless. But now they march to crush us." Berthold stepped forward, his axe resting on his shoulder, a confident grin on his scarred face. "Let them march. We've turned their knights into cowards before." Greta's voice was sharp. "But they bring more than knights this time. Scouts say they march with siege engines, with torchbearers ready to burn the forest. They are coming to erase us." A murmur of fear swept through the crowd. Hilda clenched her bow tighter. "Then we should scatter. The forest can hide us. It always has." "No," Matilda's voice was iron. "Not this time. If we scatter, we become prey again. We become shadows. But we are not shadows. We are a storm." Her gaze swept over them, fierce and unyielding. "We do not hide. We strike." Berthold laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. "Now that's more like it. Hit them before they hit us?" "Exactly," Matilda nodded. "But not with arrows from the shadows. We will strike them where they feel strongest. We will burn their pride, shatter their courage. We will remind them that we are not ghosts. We are their nightmare." A murmur of excitement mixed with fear rippled through the crowd. Hilda stepped forward, her voice uncertain. "But where? Where do we strike?" Matilda smiled, a fierce light in her eyes. "The king's camp, his grand tent. We make him tremble in his own fortress of iron." A stunned silence fell. Even Berthold's grin faltered. "Matilda, are you mad? The king's camp is a fortress. Walls, guards, knights. All the more reason to strike it," Matilda replied, her voice ablade. "He thinks himself invincible. We will show him that his walls are nothing but a prison of his own fear." Greta stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "You want us to march straight at him? Suicide?" "No," Matilda corrected. "We march to remind him that we do not fear him. We will come from the forest like a storm, and when we are done, he will wonder if the shadows are still there, even in the daylight." Berthold's laughter returned, fierce and wild. "I like it. A madness the king will never expect." "But we can't just charge in," Greta warned. "We need a plan." "And we have one," Matilda declared. "We strike when their guard is down, at night, during their feasting. We strike not to win a battle, but to shatter their spirit. Fires in their tents, arrows from the dark, chaos. The king must believe he is surrounded, that the forest itself has turned against him." Greta's lips curled into a grin. "Now, you're speaking my language." The camp buzzed with energy, men and women arming themselves, covering their faces with dark cloth, melting into the shadows. Matilda watched them, pride swelling in her chest. These were not just survivors. They were legends in the making. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive. Small bands moved through the trees, silent as whispers. Greta's group, with their bows, took the northern ridge. Hilda's group, carrying flasks of oil and torches, crept toward the eastern edge. Berthold's fighters, armed with axes, crouched by the main road. And at the heart of it all, Matilda, her eyes fixed on the distant glow of the king's campfires. The king's camp was a sea of canvas tents, banners fluttering in the cold wind. Fires crackled, and the sound of drunken laughter drifted through the trees. Knights dined on roasted meat, soldiers traded boasts, and the king himself sat in his grand tent, his armored captains around him. But the forest was not silent. It watched. It waited. Then Matilda's voice rose, a fierce whisper carried on the wind. "Now!" A flaming arrow streaked through the night, striking a tent. Flames exploded, licking at the canvas, and the laughter turned to screams. Another tent ignited, then another. Hilda's group danced among the tents, oil splashing, torches igniting, while Greta's archers rained death from above. The king's soldiers stumbled from their beds, swords drawn, but they saw only shadows. Shadows that vanished, shadows that struck. Berthold's fighters surged from the road, axes cleaving through the panicked guards. A knight charged toward Matilda, his sword raised, but she sidestepped, her dagger flashing. He fell, clutching his throat. In the chaos, the king burst from his tent, his captains around him, his eyes blazed with rage. "Fools, form up! Find them! Burn the trees!" But the forest itself seemed to roar with defiance. Smoke and flames danced, and the king's banners fell, consumed by fire. Matilda's voice rose above the chaos, fierce and clear. "We are not your slaves! We are not your shadows! We are the storm!" The king's eyes widened, his captains cursing, dragging him back. His grand tent, his symbol of power, was a pillar of flame. And as his soldiers scattered, his voice was a ragged, desperate shout. "Retreat! Back to the walls! Back to Weinsberg!" But even as they fled, the flames followed. Matilda's people melted into the forest, but their victory burned in the night, a blazing scar against the sky. Miles away, as dawn broke, Matilda's people gathered, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes bright. Greta hugged Matilda, her voice a fierce whisper. "We did it! We made a king run!" "No," Matilda whispered back, her voice calm but fierce. "We made a king fear." Berthold's laughter echoed, but Matilda's gaze turned serious. "This is not over. The king will come again, and when he does, we will be ready." Hilda stepped closer. "But how? His army is vast. His pride is wounded. He will bring everything." Matilda's smile was a blade. "Then we will show him that even an army can be swallowed by shadows. We will show him that those who fight for their homes are stronger than any king." The dawn rose over the charred forest, its golden light casting long shadows over the misty trees. Matilda stood atop a ridge, her gaze fixed on the distant smoke curling above the king's camp. Her people gathered around her, weary but triumphant, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes fierce and alive. Greta stood at her side, a proud smile tugging at her lips. "We did it, Matilda. We made the king run. We made him fear." "But this is not the end." Matilda's voice was calm, her gaze unwavering. "He will return. He is a king, and his pride is his prison. He cannot allow us to stand, not after we defied him." Hilda's voice was sharp. "Then what do we do, Matilda? Keep fighting? Keep hiding?" Matilda turned to them all, her voice rising. "Number. We do not just fight. We become something greater. We become the voice of those who cannot fight. We become the flame that cannot be extinguished. We are not just rebels. We are a promise that no tyrant can ever break those who stand together." Berthold grinned, leaning on his axe. "A promise, eh? I can drink to that." Matilda's smile softened, but her voice remained strong. "We are the women who carried our husbands from the jaws of death. We are the men who learned to stand and fight beside them. We are the storm that no king can crush. And even if they burn this forest, even if they shatter our walls, we will remain." Her people cheered, a fierce, echoing cry that shook the trees. Greta leaned close, her voice a whisper. "You give them hope, Matilda. You give us all hope." "I give them what they already have," Matilda whispered back. "Courage, strength, and a reason to fight." The wind stirred the trees, and Matilda's gaze turned to the sky. If you ever hear the story of the women who carried their husbands, remember this. It was not just about defiance. It was about love. Love that carried them through fire, through darkness, through despair. A love that turned shadows into warriors. She stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. And for those of you watching this story, remember that courage is not just for heroes. It is for anyone who dares to stand, who dares to fight for what they love. Don't ever let fear become your master. Let your courage be your flame. Thank you for watching this story. If you found it inspiring, if you felt the strength of Matilda and her people, please give this video a like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more incredible stories of courage, defiance, and legend. Until next time, remember, true strength is not just in the sword, it is in the heart.